Right, so away we go. Last lecture, we were talking about the phylum Chordata and looking at key features of what you need to have to be in that phylum. We broke it down to the subphylum, Urochordata, Cephalochordata, and then Vertebrata. Within the Vertebrata, we dropped down into the fish and covered general fish diversity. Your jawless fish, your cartilaginous fish, then your bony fish. This lecture, this chunk, is going to talk about the amphibian and reptiles, amphibians. Let me make them plural since there's more than one. So the amphibians and reptiles. So what I want you guys to think about is we had this diversity of fish evolving in the oceans for millions and millions of years, and then eventually from fish we see the evolution of amphibians. So the next slide should take you back mentally to earlier in the semester. What are the challenges of life on land? So what I want you to do is create that list. We did it already. So if it's easier, go back and look at that list we created when we talked about algae evolving to a terrestrial existence. It's the same basic list, but these are the issues, or they're the same issues that fish had to overcome in order to evolve to life on land. So think about each of the challenges, and the amphibian body plan overcame some of those challenges that allowed them to now start to live partially on land. So amphibians are still connected to the aquatic environment. If you remember early as plants, we talked about that group called the bryophytes. Hopefully these are all sounding familiar because you're going to see all this kind of stuff on the final. But the bryophytes we called amphibians of the plant world. Why is that term used for those plants? What is the key here with the amphibians? Why do we make that association? So, all right, so let's start with amphibians. So this is group, we're just going to call it a group. Some organizations will put this at class level. So you have domain, kingdom, phylum, class amphibia, amphibians. So what I want you to know about the amphibians, these are the first these are the first vertebrates to live on land. We had other animals on land. We see invertebrates, insects, some of the arthropods, etc. But amphibians are the first vertebrates, first member of subphylum Vertebrata to evolve to life on land. And we want to think about the 5 key features that make amphibians different, make them unique, make them what they are. So think about diversity of amphibians. Get this out of here. We have frogs, we have salamanders, we have newts, we have this weird group called caecilians. So there's a bunch of vertebrates, or a bunch of amphibians out there. And in general, there are these 5 key features that span amphibians. Okay, legs. Let me put some bullets on this. In general, amphibians have legs. Like I said, we'll see an exception when we talk about the caecilians. They're just a weird group of amphibians. Okay. So instead of fins, now you got legs. Legs give you structural support. to carry your weight on land. Lungs. Not real good ones, but they can breathe air. Their skin is still moist. Because they'll use their skin to breathe for respiration as well. So there's gas exchange through the skin. There's also gas exchange through their lungs. If you dry an amphibian out, it can't breathe. There's not enough gas exchange in the lungs to completely survive on land. This is why that Tritiomycota fungus, so you guys remember that one weeks and weeks, months ago, that is one of the big things that's causing a huge problem with amphibians. The fungus infects their skin, destroys their skin. Basically, they can't breathe. They die. It actually leads to cardiac arrest. When we look at the heart, they have a 3-chambered heart. So instead of 2 chambers, what we saw in the fish, now we're going to 3 chambers. 3-chambered heart increases the separation between oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood. And that separation is accomplished through pulmonary veins. So pulmonary veins are veins that go from the heart to the lungs, that connect the heart and the lungs. So it helps oxygenated blood to move differently than deoxygenated blood. So it's a much more efficient respiratory system. All right, so big key features of amphibians. Now the earliest amphibians show up around 370 million years ago. So think about the evolutionary timeline. You got your jawless fish, your jawed fish, then your amphibians. Huge explosion in diversity between 360 to about 280 in diversity. Diversity starts to decline between 280 to about 248. Physical size of amphibians got larger. I mean, there were some of these suckers that were 3 feet long. That's a huge, huge amphibian. We don't have those on Earth today. There's, I believe, 1 species that is that large. The rest, they're small. But they started to adapt to a drier environment in this 280 to 248 million year window. The Earth's climate was changing, it was drying out, and those who survived evolved and gave rise to reptiles. So that skin started to change in those amphibians, and again that gave rise to our reptilian group. So all right, so generally we break amphibians up into 3 categories. I'm not going to worry about, typically we say class Amphibia. Underneath class you have order. This is just the 3 categories beneath the amphibians. Caudata. Oh, I'm sorry, let's start with Anora. Anora is where we put our frogs and toads. Toads. Big thing here, let me make some room. On frogs and toads, they have to have the key amphibian features, but frogs and toads, they lack a tail. So, well, as adults. All right, so when a frog is little or a toad is little, they're in the salamander state, or the larval stage, tadpole stage, etc. They have the tail, but then that tail disappears as they move towards becoming an adult. So they lack the tails. The legs are adapted for jumping. For anybody who's ever played with frogs and toads, those suckers can hop and jump. Very effective in that fashion. So, and last thing to mention, frogs and toads, members of Anora, often will externally fertilize, and they're males and females, they reproduce sexually, but it's all external fertilization. All right, so that's our first group within the amphibians. Second group, the caudata. These are going to be our newts and salamanders. So identifying one of these guys, Newts and salamanders. We take a look at them. We say, okay, what makes them a unique amphibian? They tend to have long, thin bodies with tails, so that post-anal tail remains in this particular group. Where the frogs and toads, it disappears. These guys often are going to be internal, or they reproduce with internal fertilization. So you have male, female, internal fertilization occurs, and then they lay the eggs. In moist environments. If you guys have a mulch pile or a bunch of mulch around the house where there's a big thick layer of leaves, you may have a salamander within it. We have salamanders in Illinois. They're here. So take a look. I encourage you, go outside and check this stuff out. In the next couple weeks, this is the perfect time to look for these guys because they'll be trying to reproduce and get together. The last thing to mention, in general, newts and salamanders are carnivores. They're eating annelids, they're eating crustaceans, they're eating all sorts of insects. We want these guys around. Let me back up here to the Anora, something I forgot to mention. Incredibly important about them. With external fertilization, they are also carnivores as adults, typically young. They're herbivores as young. So when they're in the tadpole stage and swimming through the pond, a lot of times they're just eating algae and vegetation in the pond. If they can get plankton and things like that, great. But their dietary or their ecological niche, their dietary role does change as they mature and become an adult member of the Anora. Okay, the last group, and this is a weird one. I doubt anybody will have ever come across one of these. The last group is called Apoda. These are what we call the Sicilians. Very, very weird group of amphibians. Strictly tropical. Burrowing creatures, and they're actually legless. So it's weird that these guys have evolved and they've lost their legs because they're in this burrowing environment. They dig down under the soil, live down in the ground. They've lost those legs during their evolution. Kind of like snakes as a reptile have lost their legs. They don't need them with the ecological niche that they serve. These guys will also do internal fertilization and basically live in the tropical soils. Not much known about them. Very little research has been done on Sicilians. Enough to put them at this point in the amphibians and their own particular grouping within the amphibians. So, okay, one last thing I forgot to mention. I want to go back up here and let me make a little room. I want to put some big stars on this. I don't know where my stars are at, so let's just do ... Oh, let me take out some dots so we can see it. Bioindicator species. This will come back to us when we get into ecology. Amphibians are an incredibly important group to understand when we talk about aquatic health. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the semester. Connect it, bring it back. If your water's bad, your amphibians are dying because they are still tied to water for respiration, reproduction, for their life cycle. All right, so those are the first vertebrates onto land. And in the next lecture, we're going to jump into the reptiles.